Thank you everyone for joining us for this Water IQ webinar. My name is Catherine Garcia and I will be the moderator for the webinar. In 1959, AgSource was formed to serve Wisconsin dairy farmers. What began as a regional dairy records processing cooperative has now grown into AgSource of today, serving industries that span the entire agricultural ecosystem. From cutting-edge soil, plant tissue, and water testing to agronomic consulting and full-service DHI testing, AgSource is at its core a system of truth. One test at a time, we help our clients make the best decisions, always grounded in data. So I'm excited to introduce our two speakers for this webinar, Meredith Bowers and Amber Radatz. Meredith is the territory sales representative for AgSource Laboratories, was raised on a dairy farm and attended UW-Madison with a BS degree in food science, 15 years in product development, quality control roles in food manufacturing industry, came back to agriculture 4 years ago through Gen X in a training and development role. She is passionate about using data to make informed business decisions for her customers. Amber Radatz is the Agricultural Water Quality Program Manager for University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, with a technical background in manure management and nutrient loss of surface water, and an expertise in program development, grant writing, and communications. Amber received her BS and MS in soil science from UW-Madison. She lives with her husband, Tim, and 3 young sons in Western Wisconsin. Let me turn it over to Meredith.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to go through our agenda today. So we're going to go through water sources and their impact on your operations and how those sources can impact multiple aspects that you might not have considered before or that you might be reminded about today during our webinar. I will talk about some of the test options at AgSource and how to take and submit a sample to ensure the best results. Amber Radatz will be talking about the research that Discovery Farms Wisconsin is doing surrounding monitoring tile runoff and measuring nitrate levels in our ag system. And we'll end the session with a Q&A. So water is really king and queen and the court. So in plants and soils, water is a solvent and acts as a carrier for many substances. It forms the medium in which many chemical and biological processes take place. Without water, carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, enzymes, and other things lose their physical and chemical properties. Nutrients are also transported in aqueous solution in all animal, plant, and soil cells. So maybe the question is, why test the water? So really there's 2 key components to your water. There's whether your water is safe and whether the water is of a high enough quality to be used for what it is intended purposes. So the safety side of water is regulated in some of our operations by permit or licenses that we hold. In Wisconsin, for example, dairy operations must have a safe water test each year to maintain their milk producer license. That test looks for harmful bacteria and indicates whether there are bacteria capable of causing illness. Another safe water test that is conducted quite often in our Marshfield, Wisconsin lab location is for water used in the production of produce. That test is done on irrigation water and water that is used in vegetable and fruit processing and production. Now on the quality side, water testing helps identify the presence and levels of compounds that can impact your operation in different ways across different aspects. But what about water quality? You can have a safe bacteria result, yet still be experiencing problems with impaired production, both in livestock and in your crop and yield performances. From clogged sprayer nozzles on your spray rig to high levels of minerals and metals in your livestock drinking water, water quality can impact profitability on almost any type of operation. So of course, we know water is everywhere around us. And we're going to talk today about 4 main areas where water is impactful: our people, our livestock, plants, and the environment. And I go back to my experiences in Quiz Bowl as a FFA 4-H'er, and almost every Quiz Bowl question contest had one question that seemed to be a trick question, and it was, what's the most important essential nutrient for health maintenance? And it was water. So people would say protein, people would say carbohydrates, but it's really the water. So let's talk about water in respect to people. As I mentioned in my previous slide, Wisconsin has that annual water test, and that other test I was talking about is called a gap water test, which is a good agricultural practice test. In the livestock, we want to test water tanks and water used for milk replacer mixing, as well as water that is used in the growth of our fish in the aquaponics industry. For plants, we want to be cognizant of the water that is being used in irrigation, in our spray rigs, and definitely in our hydroponic operations. And finally, we'll talk about the environment. Some larger livestock operations must test water and monitor their runoff in compliance with their nutrient management plans and site registrations. Amber will take us through the impacts of our water and how our water practices can impact our source water and outlets from our properties. So let's talk about water for people. Bacteria can obviously cause illness when consumed through the water that we drink or other foods that we consume. The annual well testing is actually recommended by the EPA for coliform bacteria and nitrate. So if you live in a rural area and have a private well, was the last time that you tested the well you use in your house for drinking, cooking, and bathing when you built your home or purchased your house? Again, if that was more than last year, you need to be testing your water in your well. Additionally, if you live in certain areas of the country, you might also benefit from an annual screening for lead, copper, arsenic, fluoride, and pesticides or pesticide residue. If you have small children in your home, it is especially important to be testing lead and fluoride. So most private wells are located in rural areas, and compared to municipal water wells, private wells tend to be shallower, so the importance of testing should not be overlooked. You should be testing your water if it has any off odor, off color, or taste. This will help you identify a culprit and how to treat that. Here we look at a map of the United States and nitrate concentrations. So you can see the varied colors across the map. And what I'd really like you to focus on is where the color is red or darker orange. Those are the levels of concern. Levels of 10 milligrams per liter or parts per million of nitrate concentration is actually of concern as recommended or put out by the EPA. So you might ask why there's so many differences across the map. And I would explain that in that the answer lies beneath the surface. Nitrate can percolate through the soil and into the water table more quickly in certain circumstances. So let's take a look a little closer to two neighboring states in the US, Minnesota and Wisconsin. So the main reasons you'll see the variation here on these two states is due to depth of bedrock and type of geologic base, how deep the water table is to the surface, and the composition of the soil. These three factors lead to pockets or nitrate hotspots. So livestock water is, again, that key component I talked about in that quiz bowl question, right? So milk production, rate of gain, days to finishing, services per conception, and calving interval can all be impacted by poor quality water sources. And as small as 4 parts per million of iron have been shown to reduce water intake. And then most influential impact of water intake was found in content of total dissolved solids, sulfur, sulfate, chloride, nitrate, iron, manganese, and fluoride. So AgSource actually offers a livestock suitability test that tests for 14 components in your water source for livestock. There was also a study done in Iowa, northeastern and northwestern dairy herds. The sample in northwestern Iowa farms reported average concentrations of nitrate of 30 with a high of 300 parts per million. Now, both of those are over that 10 level I talked about earlier in my slide. The wells, however, in northeast Iowa averaged 25 and only had a high of 110. The wells in northwest Iowa are definitely shallower, and that's contributing to the likelihood of those higher average and the max levels we see there. Recently, a survey was done of 127 of those farms in northwestern and northeastern Iowa, and they found that DHI records and the relationships with nitrate concentrations found that the herds with drinking water levels with the highest nitrate concentrations had the longest calving intervals. So even though we might not see them decrease their water intake, their biological processes are being impacted by the contents of the water that they're drinking. On the calf side of things, calves are less tolerant than adult cattle. So some of those levels that we're talking about in an adult animal are smaller and way less, the limit is lower for calves. So in an Iowa research project, they conducted 3,618 on-farm water samples, and all of the minerals examined, except for zinc, exceeded levels desirable for livestock in at least one or more of the samples. So 3 main drivers for water intake in a water sample are iron, magnesium, and sulfur. That affects the palatability, and a calf and or cow will refuse to drink water or only drink the bare minimum to get her needs met when those 3 components are high. And then let's talk about your milk house water. So is it soft? Do you have a softener in your milk house? And that maybe not be a good thing, as sodium can affect the electrolyte balance in your cell, in the calf cells, and interferes with recovery from bouts of scours. So just as you're trying to give her more electrolytes to get her better, you're kind of counteracting that with your high sodium level in the mixed water that you're using out of your milk house if it's going through the softener. And then, as many livestock producers know, starter intake and feed intake and water intake go hand in hand. All right, moving on to water sources for plants. So plants can get its water from many different sources: natural precipitation and water cycle, irrigation, spray rig, and then obviously hydroponics. Think about all of the plants that your operation grows. Plants grown for forage and pasture, crops grown for sale off the farm, and plants grown for human consumption, including vegetables, fruits, and tree nuts. Water plays a key role in unison with the soil that supports the delivery system for the nutrients to the plant. Now think about how your plants gain access to the water they use. Is it through natural precipitation and water cycle condensation in the fields, or through irrigation perhaps? What about the spray rig applications that you might be doing on your farm? The main media used to deliver those herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers is water. And of course, water is the sole delivery medium in hydroponics. So we've covered the impact that high levels of nitrate can have on livestock. So let's take a look at how nitrate plays a beneficial role in crop and soil side of farm operations. As we know, coarse soils allow the percolation and filtration of nitrates to occur more quickly. And we already talked about the impact of shallow wells on nitrate in a water source. Often, irrigation is utilized where coarse soils are present because of their limited water holding capacity. So we have 2 factors that impact how quickly water is filtered and pulled back into the production cycle. So we want to be very cognizant of that use of the water, as nitrate is the breakdown of the chemical processes of the natural and chemically produced fertilizers. In Wisconsin, many cranberry growers are testing their water used in marshes and bogs, as well as the water used in irrigation for their crops. We have heard in the cranberry grower world that they have experienced overgrowth in the canopies when utilizing irrigation water without even adding any fertilizer. And they're attributing this to high nitrogen content in the actual irrigation water. This results in overgrowth and actually can be a detriment to the yield in the cranberry beds. And so they are monitoring their usage to make sure that they're not over nitrating or nitrogen crediting their beds. Water that is coming into contact with plants could potentially be contributing nutrients, like I just talked about. And so if you account for the nitrate correctly and monitor it properly, you can achieve the right balance of chemically applied fertilizer, probably at a cost savings to you and your wallet. So let's see how irrigation water can impact the amount of nitrogen you apply. So the nitrogen in irrigation water can supply varying amounts of nitrogen, of timely nitrogen during the growing season. It's available to the crop immediately. It reduces the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that the producer buys. And it can be credited to the crop nitrogen needs as a sound economic and agronomic practice. It also can help reduce the excess nitrates from entering the groundwater from percolation and runoff. So let's take a look at how much credit you can be given if your irrigation water source is high in nitrate. In the red box, you can see that you should be giving credit for 14 pounds of nitrogen per acre if you are applying 6 inches of irrigation water and your nitrate level was at 10 parts per million in your water sample. Now, if you go over to that far right corner of the table, you can reach upwards of 150 pounds to be credited to your fields without adding additional input costs. This slide also plays an important role in producer sustainability and stewardship of the land. Excess nitrogen that isn't absorbed by the plant eventually ends up in the groundwater and runoff from the fields. And it's an area that Amber will discuss in her upcoming slides. There's a couple other components of your water that you might want to be taking a look at. Excess sodium in irrigation water has a dispersive effect on clay soils. Soils with significant clay content, sodium will cause the clay particles to separate from each other, and they will disperse. Dispersion contributes to low water infiltration, poor tilth, and surface soil crust formation. These then reduce the ability of the soil to absorb water efficiently. Boron can also wreak havoc in certain crops as well, including cranberries. Plants with too much boron typically first show a burning effect at the tips or edges on older leaves. Fruit and nut trees may not show these leaf symptoms, but rather ooze or show cankers on limbs or the trunk. Total dissolved solids is another component that we want to be careful of in our water. It's also known as electrical conductivity, EC, or hardness. And the impact that this has on soils shows up with high salinity and impacts the performance of chemicals in sprayer applications, which I will talk about next. So there are 4 main water quality indicators related to pesticide and herbicide performance: water hardness, or EC, alkalinity or bicarbonates, pH, and turbidity. So a level of 350 parts per million of EC, or hardness, is the recommended rate for those pesticides that have a low rate glyphosate application. If you're at 700 parts per million, you want to be concerned when you have high rate glyphosate. And of course, in this instance, well water is more likely a culprit than surface water, if that's where you're gathering your sprayer water from. Bicarbonates and alkalinity can inhibit herbicide activity and make it difficult to mix your fertilizers and chemicals. This tests for the presence of sodium and calcium ions. pH is a little bit more different. It impacts solubility, has an antagonistic effect with hard water, and can degrade pesticides as well. Most cases, pHs between 4 and 7 are considered acceptable, but those herbicides in group 2 have specific pH needs to dissolve properly. Make sure you read your labels and ask your pesticide supplier if you have any questions about this. And then finally, in turbidity and cleanliness of the sprayer water. Water may contain suspended solids such as clay, and certain glycophosphates are sensitive to this, as their chemicals are readily absorbed into the soil particles, and turbid water reduces their effectiveness. All right, let's take a look at an irrigation water sample test report from our Lincoln, Nebraska lab. And you can see that The olive green shaded areas on this report on the right-hand side show the areas of concern in hardness, sodium, and chloride. On the left-hand side, you can see how the report breaks out where the water is impacting the crop, whether it's at plant growth, root or foliage contact, or soil structure. In this sample, both root and foliage contact with this water source will most likely result in problems in the field, mainly due to high sodium and chloride levels. And then I talked a little bit about milligrams per liter and parts per million, but I really think this is a good graphic to remind us of how much we're looking for when we're running a sample, a water test. So most test results that we discussed today are in parts per million, and this is equal to just 1 drop of water present in a tall trash can full of water droplets. If we are testing to the parts per billion level, then that is equal to 1 drop of water present in a whole railroad tanker car full of water. At this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Amber Radatz of Discovery Farms Wisconsin to talk about the research work that is happening in fields across Wisconsin.
Thanks, Meredith. So thanks everybody for being here today. And I already see some questions coming in the chat that we'll make sure that we have time to answer at the end. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Amber Radatz. I work with I've worked with the Discovery Farms program in Wisconsin here, and also the Discovery Farms program is part of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, and we also have a agriculture water quality program within the Division of Extension that I am managing at the moment also. So the Discovery Farms work has been going on in Wisconsin for over 20 years. And what it is actually installing monitoring equipment onto participating farmers' fields. So these are commercially, privately owned farms that volunteer to help with some research efforts related to water quality. So in the pictures that I have up now, you can kind of see what a surface water monitoring station looks like. So that's me talking in front of one of those stations. So those traditional surface water monitoring stations are in place to understand how much water moves off of a field, what is in it in terms of sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and then how the agricultural practices might relate to that. So Discovery Farms was, like I said, founded about 20 years ago in Wisconsin with the purpose of bringing farmers into the discussion and the issues of agricultural water quality here in the state. And the efforts by Discovery Farms have been farmer-led, which means that farmers are the participants. So the information is gathered off of the farms that they operate. We also have a farmer-led steering committee, which is made up of members of agricultural and environmental organizations. So they play a role in helping understand what research needs to be done in this type of realm here in Wisconsin, and then also broadcasting that information out to their groups and helping with the outreach part of things. So we also work with the United States Geological Survey on actual sample collection for these surface water and tile sites, and that has given us the ability to have super credible water quality data to be able to help shed some light on the things that are issues with especially phosphorus and nitrogen loading in Wisconsin from farms. So just a graphic to show here on the left side of what a sampling station looks like and what's included. So this is, like I said, a surface water site. I won't really talk about surface water data today, but the other types of monitoring, you can't see as much of the actual monitoring equipment because they're underground. So in a surface water site, what we have is a berm installed at the end of a waterway, and then we're able to put that flume into the waterway. It stays in place for 5 to 7 years, and then automatically takes samples when it's triggered to do so remotely, because there's water running through there. So then it automatically takes samples and stores them in the gauge house. So things like the water depth sensor and the data logger and the antenna, those things are all used to be able to tell that sampler when to take water and store it in the gauge house so that it can be analyzed for the amount of sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus that's in it. So then we take that information and overlay it with weather information, as well as the agronomics provided by the farmer, to be able to come up with information that is helpful in terms of how to adapt management practices to continue to improve or reduce the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that's leaving a field, and then improve our impact on water quality locally and regionally. So a little introduction into what projects Discovery Farms is doing in Wisconsin right now. I should also mention that Discovery Farms has there's a coordinated effort in a few different states. So Minnesota has a Discovery Farms program. There were Discovery Farms programs in North Dakota and Washington. And there's also current programs in Minnesota, Arkansas, and a new one starting up in Vermont. So we try to work together to be able to give farmers as much information as possible, farmers and their advisors. So crop consultants have become a really important audience for us to be able to engage in this water quality discussion, because I know it's not necessarily the sole reason why someone became a farmer or an agronomist is to engage in water quality discussion. It can be a little uncomfortable. And so we kind of view our role as trying to make that discussion more accessible and continue to provide information that can be adapted to farming systems wherever you are. So the projects that we're working on right now, we're working on writing up reports from a 7-year project that happened in Rock County that was focused on cover crops and dissolved phosphorus losses. So phosphorus losses that happen without sediment losses. So that report is coming. We also have 3 projects that are kind of in the middle of their tenure. These are all operated with the help of local partners. So we have one in Juneau County in western Wisconsin that's focused on cover crops and community manure application efforts. We have one in Kewaunee County on the eastern side of the state that's focused on dairy systems, cover crops, low disturbance manure, and reducing soil erosion. And then the one in blue there is Langlade County. And the reason why it's in blue is because we're actually partnering with AgSource to be our local partner on that project. That is, AgSource has a great relationship with the growers there and have a really established network. And they're helping us design a study to try to understand cover crops and verifying how runoff and nutrient loss happens in seed potato production areas. So those projects are coming along really nicely. We'll be able to start sharing more data from them now that we've got a few years of data. And then recently installed 2 very different projects, one in Marathon County, both on dairies, trying to understand how year-round soil cover plays a role in decreasing erosion and nutrient loss in heavy soils in central Wisconsin. And then one project I'll talk a little bit more about today, which is brand new for us. And it's really Discovery Farms' way of starting to engage in the discussion about nitrate leaching. So this project is in Pepin County in western Wisconsin, and the goal is to understand nitrate leaching in dairy cropping systems. So Discovery Farms has been doing water quality monitoring for a number of years, over 20 years. But as Meredith pointed out, the way that different chemical things in our environment interact with water and with soils really plays a role in what our concerns are. So in the in the case of nitrate and nitrogen, surface runoff is usually not the main pathway for nitrogen and nitrate loss. So we have to monitor that in an entirely different way. So the way that Discovery Farms is going to start to look at this question of nitrate leaching with farmers is to use this pretty unassuming looking metal box, right? It's a equilibrium tension lysimeter. And basically what that means is this box, along with 7 other of its counterparts, gets buried below the frost line in a field. And this has a porous plate on the top. You can't see the holes because they're so small, but there's a porous plate on the top, and we keep a vacuum on these boxes, and that allows water that is infiltrating through the soil profile and past the root zone to be collected in these containers. And then we can take samples of that, not only to know how much water moved through the system compared to precipitation and soil moisture measurements, but also know the analysis of the nitrate that was contained in it. So there's lots of different ways that people have monitored soil, water, nitrate movement. We've chosen to work with the Department of Ag in Wisconsin, as well as the Pepin County Land Conservation Department and the Farmer-Led Watershed Group there in Pepin County, Farmers for Health, and our extension educator there in Pepin County. We've chosen to work with these partners and Kevin Masarek of the UW Stevens Point Center for Groundwater Science and Education to be able to try and get a very good idea of when water moves through the soil profile, how much, and the nitrogen that's contained in it. So this is kind of the most comprehensive way we can understand soil water movement and the nitrogen that's contained within it. And compared to like groundwater well monitoring, what we're hoping is that this will provide more context to farmers and farm advisors than just monitoring at like a drinking water well nearby, because there's far less variables when we're monitoring something 4 feet down than when we're talking 100 feet down or something like that. So we're really hoping that this provides a more direct link between how agricultural management impacts the amount of nitrate that is moving through our system that is leaving the root zone. So these are just a couple pictures of what it looks like to install these. So it takes a lot of digging. Everything is, over 4 feet down to avoid the frost line. And then everything is installed such that we can take those samples from the edge of the field so that the actual sampling location is not in the way of the farmer, because we want the farmer to be able to just farm over these just as they, like they weren't even there. So lots of digging to get these guys installed. And lots of troubleshooting and calibration so that they actually work. So like I said, this is a method that's going to give us the most information. It also has the potential to give us a lot of headaches when things, decide that they don't want to work exactly as you hope or things like that. So kind of like farming, there's a lot of play in the system that we have to get figured out. But so this picture in the middle is Kevin Masarek, and he has installed this type of equipment in a few other places. And so we're looking forward to being able to extend this type of monitoring to more areas of Wisconsin so that we can really give farmers a much better idea of the effectiveness of the practices that are being suggested in order to reduce nitrate leaching. So what we're going to do is actually have like a control area of the field and a treatment area of the field. So there will be 4 lysimeters installed under the control area and 4 under the treatment area. And the treatment that we'll be using is the application of cover crops in this scenario. And so what our ultimate goal then is to be able to say, in this farming system, with all other variables being held equal, cover crops reduced nitrate leaching by this much percent over the 5 or 7 years that we were monitoring. So that's going to be really important information to have for Wisconsin, because there are other states that have some similar information, but we need to see how the hydrology in our vulnerable areas is different from the way that things might work in Iowa or Illinois or even Minnesota. So just to give you an idea of what data might look like from these type of projects, or what we're hoping to understand. So I have things kind of covered on here because there's a lot going on, but what you can see right now is in Kevin's work at Stevens Point, at a farm near Stevens Point, he's been monitoring for more than 4 years now, but there's 4 years included on this graph. You can see what crop was on the field each year, and then the amount of fertilizer that was added. And then also included on this page is the amount of nitrogen included from the irrigation water. So what Meredith talked about with crediting that nitrogen from irrigation water is really important, because in terms of our nitrogen use efficiency and impact on our water resources, we need to really take into account all nitrogen sources. So you can see that the nitrogen added through fertilizer plus the nitrogen added through irrigation water is listed there on the top. So then here is a graph with lots of things on it, but I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things that, you know, it's very difficult to get this kind of information. And for our farmers and farm advisors, having this level of information is going to be super helpful in actually getting towards solutions that will work both for our agricultural community and for our water quality. So over here is the legend. So you can see, what you can see is that the color of the dots on this graph changes based on the concentration of nitrate in the sample. So the darker the dot, the higher the concentration. So Meredith's graphic of the waste paper basket or the tanker truck, kind of think about that in terms of concentration. So like, how many drops of dye would you put into each of those containers filled with water, right? And that is the concentration. So the darker the dot on here, the higher the concentration. You can see the range goes from 0 up to past 60 parts per million or milligrams per liter of nitrate. The other important part of this to understand is that the bigger the dot, the more water that was in the sample, right? So, so that means that we're going from 0 millimeters of water to 60 millimeters of water. And even though even 60 millimeters of water is not much, we still have, you know, variation between the samples. So you can kind of use this graph to correlate the concentration of what was the samples that were taken at that time, as well as the amount of water that went through the soil profile. So the last thing I'll just draw your attention to before we talk about any trends on here is just the green lines are when the crop was planted and the red lines are when the crop was harvested. So first of all, what you can really see very well in this graphic is just that there's a lot of time in Wisconsin where there's nothing growing on this field, right? And so as we think about that and trying to understand the impact of cover crops, we just have a lot of fallow time to contend with, where we can see that there really are significant nitrate movement during those fallow times. So that's the first big trend I want you to notice. So the second one is just like, this data is messy, and trying to get enough information in different parts of the state and enough years of information to understand really how nitrogen applied impacts that nitrate leaching based on weather at different times of the year. And really relating all these factors together is going to be a huge part of the information that we need to provide to farmers, and and our ability to be able to suggest management practices that can, you know, hopefully reduce our nitrate leaching loads. So that's just starting that project. We just installed them in the fall. We're looking to install more this year in 2022. That the data I showed is from Kevin Masarek's work, and as Discovery Farms gets more data on that, there will be definitely more information to share. But I wanted to just share a little bit of Discovery Farms information related to tile drainage. So just because, you know, we're really keeping the focus on nitrogen here today. And like I mentioned earlier, surface runoff is not necessarily the venue where you actually see a lot of nitrogen movement. It can be associated with sediment loss in surface losses, we sometimes see some nitrogen movement as ammonia if there's been like a manure application or if it's cold weather, things like that. But the majority of nitrogen movement, especially as nitrate, happens either in agricultural tile drainage or in leaching, like I mentioned in the last study. So Discovery Farms worked with the Discovery Farms Minnesota program to really understand, to really do a comprehensive look at how to make tile drainage monitoring more accessible for more people. So in Wisconsin, you can see the counties highlighted there where this work took place. And in Minnesota, you can see those counties highlighted. In general, in Minnesota, there's a lot more tile drainage than Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, it's pretty regional to the eastern side of the state, although it's growing in popularity in other parts of the state as well. But really, it's not a matter of deciding whether tile drainage is good or bad. It's just another thing to consider as you design your farm management and as you consult with people who might have tile drainage on their farm. So these were the goals of the project, to be able to provide tools for farmers and advisors to actually do some monitoring on their own. So here's what we found. So this is a graph to kind of drive home that point, what I mentioned before, of the annual total nitrogen loss. You can see how much happens in surface runoff, and then a much bigger range and higher medians, higher quartiles for tile flow. So for surface runoff, we typically see 2 to 10 pounds per acre of nitrogen loss or nitrogen movement. And for tile, that range is more like 7.5 to almost 40 pounds per acre. So a really significant amount of movement there. So, you know, as you think about management, what things have we seen that really like land those nitrate concentrations higher? Well, one of them is crop type. So both corn and soybean had higher medians for the average annual nitrate concentration in our tile drainage work. You might be looking at soybean and thinking, why would soybean be a higher nitrogen concentration? And I wondered that myself too, but then there's some other information about the previous crop type and how, having corn as the previous crop also brings up our medians for the following year crops. So perhaps soybean is seeing a bit of a residual from corn being a typical rotation with that, even though soybean isn't seeing a lot of nitrate application to it as a crop. And then you can see other things like dry beans, wheat, and alfalfa, a lot lower nitrate values and concentrations on average for those crops. One big thing too to consider is just really making sure that you've considered nutrient management very closely and all of the nitrogen sources that you're using. So whether that is legume sources or manure sources or commercial sources, or perhaps all three, and being very vigilant about what the crop needs are, because we do see a major increase in the nitrate concentrations in tile once those nitrogen application rates get above 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So making sure that we are using all of those best management practices and really understanding what the crop needs are and having realistic yield goals is going to be the thing that's going to play a huge role there. So I'm going to send it back to Meredith to talk about, ways to do good sampling and the opportunities available at AgSource. But I'll just say in conclusion from that tile study, really biweekly water quality samples of tiles are actually very accurate, similarly to installed equipment that costs tons of money. They're very similar accuracy for nitrate. So if you're interested and have agricultural tile drainage on your farm, doing biweekly water quality samples whenever that tile is running will really help you understand the nitrate concentration trends of your tile systems based on crop type, nitrogen applications, things like that. And then, you can make those choices about how to adapt to that. So I'll also put in the chat, there was a really great webinar on more in depth on the tile drainage work from Discovery Farms. And I'll put that in the chat so that you can access that as well. So Meredith, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thanks, Kate. Okay. So now that we've piqued your interest and maybe given you some very good reasons to test water in your operations or your customers' operations, AgSource kind of makes it easy for you in a 1, 2, 3 step process. So we have a website where you can request your water kit online, and then we mail them directly to your address at no charge to you. When your kit arrives, there'll be a sampling guide inside. So if you've requested an irrigation water kit, test kit, you'll get a sampling guide for irrigation water. If you've requested a drinking water test kit, you'll get a sampling guide for that. So that is gonna kind of guide you through the steps as to what you're gonna need to do. And then the last part of that kit and your job is to fill out the water sample form that is provided in the kit, and then drop it in the mail or drop it off at a lab, AgSource lab near you, if that is possible. If you get results back and there are water quality issues, you can certainly contact the lab that conducted the test, and we can help you through analyzing some of the results and giving some ideas for next steps for you. And then just a good sample is obviously the foundation to accurate results. And so we want to make sure that we remind you to use a sterile bottle if it is required for the test. Some tests will actually use a preservative type bottle where different tests require different bottle types. Follow the sampling instructions. Make sure you label your sample bottle correctly. So if you're taking 3 or 4 samples and all of them say irrigation on them, we don't know if you took that from the irrigation well 1 or 2 or field name. So the more information you give us, that will come back on the report result to you as well. And then make sure you fill out a sample submission form and chain of custody form information if that is required. And then there are certain holding times on specific water tests and some temperature requirements. And so if you are taking those kinds of samples, make sure to get those into the lab in a timely manner or package them when you're shipping them with some ice so that they arrive in the correct temperature range. And then I want to share with you where our laboratories are located throughout the United States. So we have labs in Lincoln, Nebraska, Ellsworth, Iowa, Menominee, Wisconsin, Marshfield, Wisconsin, and Bondwell, Wisconsin. And our headquarters are located in Madison, Wisconsin. That's all I have for today. I'm going to pass it back over once again to Kate, and she's going to talk to you guys about your CCA soil credits.
Thank you to both Meredith and Amber. We did have a few questions come in, and we will get to those. We just have a couple more housekeeping items before we get to answer those. Thank you to everyone for your time. In order to receive CEU credits, you can scan the QR code on the screen right now from within your CCA app to self-report. We will also have a form you can fill out in the email following our webinar. When you exit the webinar, you will see a survey. We encourage you to take the survey to give us your feedback on the webinar and let us know what webinars you would like to see from us in the future. So like I said, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and additional resources in the next couple of days. So be sure to be watching your inbox. So thank you everyone for the great questions that were submitted. I know that Amber was nice enough to answer one via text, but just in case anyone else was interested, one of the questions we did have come in was, how do you suggest water sampling a stream or river that runs through your farm property?
So I can take a little bit of, add a few extra words to that. So I put an answer in the Q&A. And so in Wisconsin anyways, which I know we probably have viewers from other parts of the country, but in Wisconsin, there are some criteria put out by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that they use to sample small streams. So, following a protocol like that, where you are sampling monthly, kind of at the same time of the month, from May to October, does give you a pretty good idea of nitrate, especially nitrogen concentrations and phosphorus concentrations as well in these streams. So I would just say as you're considering doing something like that, really making sure that you work with local resources or work with Meredith and others that are have some experience in the best way to take those samples and really know what you're looking for. Like, if you just want to get an idea of where values are at, that's really great. Also consider that perhaps you don't have control over the entire water quality that comes through that stream, right? So there might be land that's managed by someone else that contributes water to that area. So knowledge is power, right? Information is always great, but just have realistic expectations about what you might do with it.
Thank you so much, Amber. And another question we had come in that kind of also feeds to that based on your response was, how can we test reservoir supplied water and how close to irrigation should we be sampling that water?
That's a good question. I have not had a lot of experience with reservoir supplied water, especially for irrigation. I assume you're asking, Nathan, about testing it for nitrogen so that you could take those credits. I would, just start a sampling protocol. So if you're going to start sampling it monthly or something like that and see if you see any trends. But I think it'd be pretty tough for you since nutrient management planning is done kind of on like an annual basis, it's going to be tough for you to adjust your nitrogen application and irrigation application just based on that information that you get about the concentration of the water. So I would just start with some kind of consistent protocol like monthly or something like that to get a better idea of how much nitrogen is in the reservoir water at different times, and then maybe try and use that information for the next year of nutrient management planning.
Thank you. And then we did have another question come in through the chat, Amber. What management practices sort to the top for water quality?
That's a great question. So we're still sorting some of those out, right? So for nitrogen, what we've seen is that the kind of like big three and three different levels are, so our like the first tier level of good stuff to do is all of our nutrient management planning things, right? Like right place, right source, right timing, right application method. And so really making sure, like I mentioned, that application rates are in line with crop needs, that we have realistic yield goals for crops. We're utilizing all the technology we can with split application or slow release fertilizers or any of those pieces. So like that whole package is good for water quality, especially from a nitrogen standpoint. Then we go to another tier, which the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy considers better. And I'm using air quotes, even though you can't see me. They consider that like the better choices, and those include things like cover crops. They include things like starting to look at including small grains in rotations. So really that starts to get towards the end of looking at crop rotations and trying to see if there are ways that we can incorporate crops into our farms and farming systems that are less less intensive nitrogen users. So you don't have to supply as much to make a crop, and perhaps then that lowers the actual loading to groundwater. So those are kind of questions that we still have yet to have tons of information on in Wisconsin, but other states have started to do some work on that. And then best, according to, like I said, the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, would be things like finding ways to take parts of fields out of production that are not living up to our production goals, or are not productive for some reason, or incorporating more perennials into the crop rotation, or more perennial cover into the landscape. So there's definitely lots of different options. And as it relates to nitrogen and phosphorus, we really need to take kind of a landscape view of this. It's not just one field or one practice. It's really stacking those practices up and putting the right things in place in different parts of the landscape.
Thank you so much, Amber. That completes all the questions that we had come in. We appreciate everyone's time, and thank you so much to both Amber and Meredith for your time and your expertise. I know it was a valuable piece of information for all of our attendees, and we look forward to having you working with you in the future, as well as possibly having our attendees back for a future webinar. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day and be safe this spring.